So I'm Lant Pritchett. I'm the moderator of the question and answer that follows these three really, really interesting and presentations. I was just reminded the other day by something else there's a movie called Shine about a concert pianist who has mental illness and descends into insanity. And at one point he is a student and trying to learn to play some extraordinarily difficult piece by Rachmaninoff. And his teacher says, "You'd have to be crazy to play Rachmaninoff." And the student says, "Yes, I know. Am I crazy enough to play Rachmaninoff?" So they're sort of crazy and crazy enough. And I have to say this session overall is pretty crazy. In the sense that if you said, what are the 10 things that are under discussion in your country about how we would promote economic growth, like going out and getting foreigners is not in the top 10. Infrastructure, monetary policy, trade policy, investment, education, I can name tick, tick, tick. Just haven't heard anybody in Peru saying, we got to get us some foreigners. Just not sort of huge on the agenda. And if you look at the political environment of country after country after country, I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but what's her first name? Le Pen?
Marie, yeah.
Like, Marie Le Pen, guys. It's like all over the world, like hostility to foreigners politically and its manifestations in politics seems to be on a very sharp upward rather than a very sharp downward trend. So, so we're definitely into something new and different in this session. We're not like repeating the conventional wisdom about the importance of infrastructure or the importance of a stable education system. This is really new and different relative to the conventional wisdom about what promotes development and what promotes country prospects. So I would like to start with 3 questions, and one for each of the panelists, and then we'll throw it open to questions from the audience. I want to start with Enrico. A question, one of the tensions that you kind of mentioned of the kind of let's look at the long-term historical determinants is it's sort of like studying earthquakes. Like nothing happens, and then a lot of stuff happens, and then nothing happens. So, how do you relate the dynamics, which seem to often be very short-term? China's gone from being a desperately poor to a quite rich place in 40 years after 4,000 years of history in which it remained a quite poor place. How do you reconcile these long-term diffusional dynamics with the short-term dynamics of fertility? In Italy, for instance, stayed very, very, very high, very, very long. They were close to France geographically, at least for hundreds of years, where France had replacement fertility, and then all of a sudden fertility, as you know, in Italy just fell off a cliff, more or less. So how do you reconcile the long term with the dynamics? And let me ask all 3 questions. Sarah? Sorry, Sarah. You sort of ended with recommendations for the United States, which kind of as development people, we're not so concerned about.
Yeah. Not too. It should be.
The United States is plenty rich. Not that we couldn't be richer, but I think of a Peru or a Tanzania or a Ethiopia. Like if the U.S. is having trouble continuing to attract skilled labor, and there's agglomeration effects, like what would I even imagine doing to attract high-skilled labor to specific industries in countries that want to make progress? So I'm Ethiopia. What would I do to bring the kind of talent that I would need in order to be competitive, in order to make progress, when in some sense not only am I losing Ethiopian talent to the rest, I want to not just lose Ethiopian talent, I want to attract talent, and what would anything from a poor to a middle income country imagine doing in which you could overcome the disadvantage of agglomeration effects. And maybe it's impossible. Feel free to say, you're screwed. And then finally on just if we could draw a few more lessons about even when you're attracting foreigners, about how you overcome the political obstacles to actually benefiting from the spillover effects. So to some extent, Saudi Arabia has a bunch of spill, but they're not getting any spill over. It's not diffusing. And that a lot seems to be hinged back to political effects. It's like, we're really nervous about having these bodies of foreigners in our body politic, and hence a lot of the restrictions are treating them as if they were an invasion into the body politic, and we have to surround them with an immune system that prevents them. How do you overcome that? Can you overcome that economically without overcoming it politically? Can you really get the economic spillovers of high-skilled labor without actually integrating them into the body politic? Thoughts you have on that? So just quick responses.
That's a very, very interesting and deep question. A way to think about it is that it's very, very hard to predict onsets of new phenomena. So where it starts. So the Industrial Revolution started in Britain, but Britain was not the frontier even 200 years ago. Some people might say maybe it was northern Italy or the Flanders, and even before it was China, and even thousands of years ago it was in Mesopotamia the frontier. So the frontier changes. And it's very hard because sometimes these are one-time phenomena, and they are overdetermined. There are 1,000 theories of why the Industrial Revolution in Britain rather than somewhere else. So that it changes. So that's very hard. What it's a bit easier, although still challenging, but it's easier once you have a new frontier, then you see how the diffusion spreads, and then you have a long pattern. Now, we find that on average, you can predict reasonably well, of course on average statistically with exceptions. That said, you still have this sudden phenomena. Now, one way that now we are trying to capture some of this building on the literature on social interactions is that very often it's social influence. So take the fertility behavior. Until I see, it's not contagion. Contagion, I just see somebody having less children. Oh, I could do the same thing. That's contagion. But sometimes you need social influence. I need to see a critical mass of people that behave that way, that are in my group. So I see a lot of people that I trust or that I interact with that are adopting the new technology or the new behavior, and now they are in favor of democracy. Then suddenly I will join. Once you join, it becomes a cascade. It becomes, and it can happen very quickly. It can happen not even in less a generation. It can happen in a few years. So in that sense, that's still part of the diffusion. But then you have these sudden things. And that makes it fascinating. I think that now more and more economists are using these tools of social interaction, social influence, and now the challenge, of course, is how you measure these things that typically you don't measure in economics, and in order to understand things that we want to explain in economics. So that's where I think, but it's a very interesting dynamic, onset versus diffusion and the speed of diffusion. So I hope that more and more micro work will shed light on that.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So that was a hard question. So I think the first short answer is that I think to some extent many countries are sort of screwed with this because what people are looking for are those sort of high-skilled teams they want to join with high payoffs, and you can't sort of just suddenly form, say, a new Harvard in some place where there wasn't a Harvard before that would attract a lot of that kind of talent. What countries have done and what sort of remote regions in specific countries have done is, for example, they fund somebody to go abroad to get their doctorate and then have an agreement that the person will return for a specified amount of time to their home country before they're allowed to leave again to sort of pay back for the investment that the country makes. So that may work to some extent. But I think the more hopeful thought would be to go back to a little bit what Ljubica was saying. It seems like the skill diffusion that can happen, and it could happen even across international borders. A lot of immigrants carry kind of ties to their home countries, sort of either sort of family ties or other ties, as well as sort of emotional ties. And the knowledge diffusion can happen, and in fact happens much more readily within people who share the same sort of ancestry, history, whatever. That maybe instead of sort of trying to attract people physically to be there, you could try to attract some of that know-how, some of those networks, some of the stuff that people have Finland is trying to sort of build some of these networks as well. Finland is doing, nobody's very worried about Finland probably either, but a lot of countries could also think about it more strategically in terms of how can they gain from the migrants who left, who may or may not return, but they're helpful even when they're gone.
But just to follow up, in some sense, the scope of agglomeration economies is very worrisome, because if
Yes.
there's both agglomeration economies and they have broad scope, then even places like Finland that only has 4 million people?
I think we are even up to 6 now.
6, okay,
Yeah.
6 million people. You know, you can imagine maintaining within Finland narrow agglomeration. We're going to have the world's best pottery design. But do you think agglomeration has large scope, or do you think agglomeration has narrow scope?
I agree with you that it's the problem of some of the scope is hard, and it may be hard to overcome, but maybe we have to go back to now what you were saying, that things may change very quickly, so places do gain an advantage sort of sometimes seemingly over all of a sudden, so there are sort of these turnaround cases that were narrow scope and then it can sort of build. So Finland, for example, Nokia was producing tires, and then all of a sudden they became the leading manufacturing of mobile phones, and they developed a whole network of small companies, huge sort of, from Finland's base scope, agglomeration of joined industries and companies, and actually drew a lot of international talent. Lots of people wanted to work in that industry. So it can happen quickly and sort of need to be strategic.
Hard question as well. I guess one thing that I've seen since I started working at CID and engaging with different countries is that a success of a policy does not only depend on how good the policy was, but how did you tell the narrative around your policy. So on this issue of migration, I recently listened to how Singapore presents its policy of openness to so many migrants and foreign companies. And what they would do, they would openly and generously tell about the foreigners that come to them and the kind of knowledge they brought in. And I was just telling our Sri Lankan partners how they honored the Sri Lankan doctors that work in Singapore, and acknowledging how important this was for all the surgeries that were done and all the health issues that were solved because we have the Sri Lankans in Singapore. So I think the way that we have seen unjustified attack on migration through unjustified narratives, you can put forward these positive narratives to go along with the policy. And probably you know better than anyone else that places actually that have more migration are, even if it's not because they chose to be, even if they're not the hubs of California and Massachusetts, they tend to think better about their migrants, right? It's the places that don't have them, that they haven't experienced them, that are most afraid of them. And this is something maybe we should talk more about.
Okay. Let's throw it open to questions. Have we got a mic, or what are we doing? I don't know. We have a mic, so why don't we start 1, 2, 3, 4 questions, and then we'll start with another round with you.
Hi, I'm Maura Neal. I'm at Berkeley. I was with USAID. I have a question about the Mexican workers, if I've understood this correctly. When they return to Mexico, they mimic essentially the U.S. economy and the jobs that they do. So 2 questions. Do you have any data on whether they actually start businesses or whether they just meld into the existing businesses there? And if I read your slide correctly, they increase employment goes up by 9%. Have you calculated at all what the multiplier effect is of those numbers coming back?
Why don't we
Great.
take all 4? I think it was there and then back there.
Isn't there some sort of a major conflict between the concept of the sense of us and bring more foreigners in? Because the sense of us takes a bit to create culturally where people share a set of factors with each other, and then bring more people in, the time to absorb them into the culture. So, and how does that conflict can be resolved and has to be resolved?
I think you presented convincing evidence that moving brains is easier.
I'm hard of hearing, so if you could stand up and project, I'd appreciate it.
No. I think you made a convincing case. It's easier to move brains than skills, to putting skills into brains. But I'm concerned about the implications for skills formation policies, precisely because I think it's immigration policy is politically difficult to do. And even if all countries were to liberalize migration, I'm not pretty sure that all countries arrive to the same outcome. There would be a self-selection into certain industries and regions. So I think we should not be forgetting about the difficult task of creating the right skills for different industries, for different countries.
And then one last question in this round.
Juan Carlos Zapata from Fundesa in Guatemala, a country that is actually increasing migration towards the U.S., not as you mentioned in the case of Mexico, unfortunately. There are a lot of migrants coming into the U.S., most of them just were trying to get jobs at the end of the day. What would you recommend to policymakers in Washington, D.C.? Because at the end of the day, U.S. is increasing economically, demanding more jobs. Guatemala is not creating that many jobs, so there's always going to be people trying to migrate. What would your recommendations be because I know that the political aspects, we know about it, but from the technical point of view. Thank you.
Okay.
One more. Okay.
So I could.
Why don't we take another round? Because we have 4 on the table, and why don't we handle those 4 and then move on? One very specific on Mexico, one on us versus them, one on skills, and one on U.S. politics.
I could take the one.
Why don't we start from...
Yeah, so I will particularly answer the question on whether bringing people that are different culturally, historically, would bring conflict and political conflict, or in group versus out group. That question. If I have to say, partly the answer as an economist, I would say yes and no. And in fact, if I can advertise my own work again with Rome, and something that I didn't mention in the slides, but is very closely related, we have done work on war and relatedness, whether populations that are more closely similar culturally, genetically, historically, are more or less likely to go to war with each other. And we have a new paper on the heterogeneity, the political economy of heterogeneity and conflict, that the bottom line of that is that it depends what you're fighting about. If we are fighting about public goods that we have to share, and if we have different preference about the public good, like this panel itself is a public good. Everybody has to listen to us, whether you like it or not, in this room. So if you don't like us...
There's a lot of cell phones out, actually.
Yeah, well, that is true. But if you want a live discussion, it's us or nothing. So in that sense, if you have diverse preferences about what you should going on here, there could be conflict. And if you could change the channel, if we were a television channel, you could fight over the remote control with somebody different from you. But if it's about rival goods, which if I consume it, you don't consume it. If we have different sandwiches and some are with ham, some with chicken, it's good to have diversity. When we talk about skills, talents, everything that has, that's why with gains from trade, it's all about diversity and the gains from immigration. So there is a trade-off. It's not all one thing. There are cost and benefit from heterogeneity, and they have to be weighed against each other. But very often, you have the most conflict over territory, over things, between populations that are more similar with each other, not less similar. Sometimes by bringing heterogeneity, you reduce conflict. This is also, it depends on what you're fighting about. Sometimes it increases. So in that sense, I think it's an empirical question, but there is no a priori answer that having more diverse people would necessarily increase political conflict. And also very much depends on how it's framed, of course, political, and how it's used by political entrepreneurs. I mean, that's a whole, so that would be my... And I will let the other members of the panel answer the specific questions about immigrants and Mexicans and so on. That were also very interesting.
So that's very interesting, and I will recommend that you later also speak to Dario, who sits there, because he can give you like the details of the study. So I read his study, so I'll tell you what I know from reading it. They looked into the channel of entrepreneurship, and they didn't find that it's a significant channel. So I think what they're more seeing is that complementarity between the people at home and the new skills coming in. But this is anecdotal evidence. It's more like by reading the news. Something that's happening, it's judging by the news, is that when you make it difficult for American firms to bring the Mexican workers in, they consider moving to Mexico. So, and sometimes these connections, where they choose to go to Mexico, would be based on where the people that worked for them return to. So you may have some decisions that have been made to just follow where your workers went. So if they went to a certain province, you follow them there. So there might be something of that going on, but I don't know how significant that is. And regarding the multiplier effect, I don't think that this was done. But if Dario's study is similar to the Albanian one, it's difficult to distinguish how many jobs were created because of more demand, because there's just like larger population now in a place, and how many jobs were actually created because of this entrepreneur, creating X number of jobs. So I think there is a little bit of both more demand and also more jobs being created.
Oh, so I'll sort of try to talk about the policy. Although, like, I agree with the people who ask, it is very, very difficult, and I'm like at least a three-handed economist when I start thinking about policy, because it sort of starts to lead you down a path that's very hard to think about. So all countries have obviously some kind of an immigration policy. They don't at all sort of work hand in hand with each other. So I think, sort of trying to even understand what the global immigration policy of the net of immigration policies of all of the countries is doing is, at least for me, it's practically impossible. And the way things work, it certainly doesn't guarantee that every country has a chance of getting some skilled immigrants, or that there's any kind of a perfect distribution of skilled immigrants globally. So I think there's definitely room to try to discuss this, and with the current sort of climate regarding immigration, I don't know if it's a fruitful climate to discuss immigration policy. Maybe it is, because at least there's not a sort of seems to be common agreement that this is a topic that should be discussed. But there's no sort of, I don't see an easy answer to that. In terms of the DC guys and sort of how they're thinking, how they should be thinking, most of the stuff we have worked on is mostly related to skilled immigration, and generally that's sort of the easy one, because it's picking like the Finns say raisins from the bun, and we have most of the studies on skilled immigration show that they have on average positive impacts on the receiving countries, and they don't seem to have any large negative impact even sort of among competing workers. There's a few people who would disagree in specific cases like computer programming. Perhaps we see some of that, but in most cases we sort of think that they generate so many positive externalities that that's sort of an easy one to deal with. But even though the US still doesn't seem to find it very easy, but most other countries would find that the easy part. The hard part is sort of on the less skilled side of migration. So US certainly does have jobs where that labor is highly in demand. Whether stopping low-skilled migration into the US would somehow increase jobs for the American workers is a more complicated question. I don't think it necessarily would, because a lot of the jobs available at the going wage rate, the Americans are not willing to do, so migrants will do the jobs. And then if you then decided that you're going to cut down migration in large quantities, perhaps, you would assume that maybe the wages would have to adjust in order to attract more American workers, but that might also mean that certain sectors would be entirely kind of they wouldn't be even any more competitive to do in the US, but might sort of all move abroad, which may or may not be a bad thing, but it becomes immediately such a complex chain reaction I'm bad at giving advice to the DC politicians, but my general sense is that making the life of migrants in the U.S. as hard as possible is probably not going to be the best possible answer to anything.
I know I'm moderator, but if I could, I think the us question is the, in some sense, central question, and if I could just say like two things about it. One is a little bit less the United States, but Europe has to solve this problem because otherwise it dies. Mm-hmm. The fertility transition has been excessively successful.
Yes.
Blame the French. Blame the French.
Yeah. No, not the French. Interestingly, France's fertility today.
Oh no, these days it's okay. No, they started. It's much worse in Italy than in France now.
Exactly. No. I mean, French fertility has roughly what it was.
It went back.
They got to 2 very early in the state of 2.
No, they started, but they
other countries have dived. But the point is that to have anything like the current support ratios of retirees to labor force, you need 120 million more workers in the next 35 years in Europe, and what the indigenous production of natives is going to produce is 60 million less. So you need 200 million more labor force aged people in Europe over the next 35 years. So Europe doesn't have an immigration problem, Europe has an integration problem. If Europe can't solve the integration problem, it's really headed for truly difficult times because it just can't sustain its current way of life with an inverting demographic pyramid. It needs these people as much as they want to come, and yet Europe hasn't defined an usness that's broad enough. And if I could say one other thing about usness is the social construction of usness as national, border-driven is an extraordinarily recent innovation in human history. Mm-hmm. Nation as a strong social identifier is maybe a century old. Not much more. And so the idea that usness and Venezuelan or Peruvian or American is a strong and historically inevitable usness I think is just not on, and it's going to change in ways that we probably can't predict. And I think having a variety of usnesses within a national border, I think allows the creation of multiple usnesses. So just to give a personal example, I happen to be a Mormon, which is a small Christian denomination that's quite insular in many ways, but half of the Mormons in the world don't live in the United States. So if you look at the political dynamics, Utah is an extremely conservative, Reagan got 76% of the vote in Utah, but Trump got his lowest vote share in Utah of any red state because the whole you just can't have a anti-immigrant sentiment around a religious community that sees a religious usness, right? So again, I think the usness problem has to be solved, but B, I think it's going to be resolved by sooner or later the exclusive association of us with national identity is going to erode in super important ways, but in ways that we probably can't predict. But I think one of the ways it's going to erode is the creation of multiple usnesses and the vision of nations as being collection of usnesses in a bigger us. And then we can tolerate lots of us's. Wow, that was terrible. But
so
roughly terrible, but roughly accurate. Okay, so we're going to start 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, we'll take 5 questions this round. So we'll start with the one we had left over.
Hi.
If everybody could stand up and project, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I just wanted to know in the studies, how much does the urban design or the quality of cities within these countries correlates with the migration patterns? Because as humans, we like to live in very nice places. It might be very hard for a country that doesn't have the money or the nice cities to attract talent. So you might want the HighSkilled, but you don't have the quality for the people to say, I'd rather live in Paris than live in Sri Lanka somewhere.
Second question?
It's not. First of all, I want to make a correction. Saudi Arabia does have a way to get a citizenship in Saudi Arabia, although be it in the recent years a bit more strict, but a big portion of Saudi is people with citizenship rather than originally from Saudi Arabia. The question is actually, it's a dilemma that we are facing in Saudi Arabia, which you just pointed out. I mean, the tendency in Saudi Arabia during the boom days, what we call the boom days, was to get unskilled, very low paid workers, and those are composed the bulk of the 10 million that you referred to. And these typically come from the subcontinent and the Far East. And these typically don't speak Arabic or don't, integrate into the society. So generalizing, I'm working these things, but what I'm trying to say is that how to convert that, how to make it a high-skilled job. Today, if you make a policy, you are going to get, by the way, we do some fixing and give permanent residence to some specific groups that have political problems back home or something like that. But generally speaking, how do you do that? I mean, how do you fix that? I don't have the talent that I want to keep. The talent that I want to keep typically leaves Saudi Arabia. They come, get trained, and then they leave because they could have a better prospects elsewhere. That's my question. Thank you.
3?
Yeah, I want to share a few numbers with you that are seldom talked about, probably because we all feel guilty for slavery, and we don't want to put a dollar amount on what is an educated human being worth. In the United States, to bring a child from birth through high school, lower middle class child, minimum education, it cost around $500,000. To bring a child between society and family, to bring a child from birth through Harvard, it cost $1.5 million. And if you want to bring it to a graduate level, it's more like $1.7 million. Exactly what the right weight of an immigration force is, I don't know, and I don't know what is ideal. But let's say the United States imports human capital to the tune of 1.5 million immigrants a year. That is equivalent in terms of social savings for the country to about $1.5 trillion per year of savings. So if you want to push those numbers, you can push them for every country in the world. The fact is that we've been discussing forever whether we should bring $2 trillion of corporate savings that have been stored away outside of the United States in profits that have not been repatriated because people don't want to pay taxes on them. But the immigration flow currently from other countries into the United States is equivalent to $1.5 trillion of savings. So if you want to have growth when you do not have savings, the one way in which you can act, which is the case of the United States, the one way in which you can assure growth rates through human capital savings produced by not having to raise so much human capital, that is the one sure way of doing it.
That's interesting. We had 3 and 4 over there somewhere, so. Oh, 4 is here, 5's there.
I really like the example with the returning migrants from United States to Mexico and how they bring new culture, new know-how, new capabilities to the country. So I have 2 questions. First, do we distinguish between why do we distinguish between returning migrants and just immigrants? Because from the economic point of view, they're more or less equivalent. Except, yes, now we've discussed this question of usness. Yes, these are our people who are returning, and these are just, others who come and take our jobs, even though, I don't care if my job is taken by someone returning from my tribe or someone else. That's one. And second, this comes back to the question of importing know-how and institutionalized know-how. Do we distinguish between people who come and work here and who come and teach us to bring new capabilities by teaching it? Because I mean, one teacher could substitute 5 people coming and just doing that for us.
Hi, Arturo Jimenez from Colombia. I heard some of you saying, how can poor countries do to attract this type of high-skilled talent? And I was wondering, is it always necessary to have a high-complexity project, like for example in Panama City, to bring high-skilled workers to this type of low-income country? High-skilled, high-complexity projects require high-skilled workers, and I believe it will generate different types of innovations inside the cities, innovations that won't replace work of people with lower types of skills. So that could be one of the solutions, and what other solutions can they have? And another question was, is it a short-term solution? Because when you bring high-skilled workers permanently, you said you started depending on that permanent flow of high-skilled workers, but when there's a political change, like for example in the US, that may stop. So that may be a temporary solution. Does it need to become complemented, for example, with a permanent solution, like actually higher skilled education, when you implement this type of policies? Thank you.
So, may I take make a comment that I think touches on many of the general questions here. A big issue is, how do we take advantage of all these benefits of mobility, of this back and forth? So a big challenge is to attract people to countries that typically don't have a lot of flows. If I go there, how would I be able to come back? Would I be able to keep back and forth? A general theme is national borders. Ideally, as economists, we would like national borders not to be economic barriers, to disentangle national borders from economic barriers. This is traditionally done for trade, where we have the gains from trade. We would like to do it also for people, ideally. But the problem is that my feeling is that if we do it in a way that is perceived by people that have control over national borders, that feel they should be sovereign by the people that vote, and there is no democratic legitimacy about policies that have to do with the national borders, then we have a backlash. We have backlash. Then we have people wanting to build walls and to make national border barriers. In Europe, much more than in the United States, there has been a complete lack of democratic legitimacy perceived by the population about the European policies. Migrants come, and sometimes they come on boats in ways that is perceived as not part of a policy, it's just reactive. And then they move across national borders that are being eliminated to create a single market and so on, in ways that the local population perceives as not their decision, and it's not us, right? Going back to the question. So we need democratic legitimacy. Now, and this is about, and it's very often national borders are public goods, and going back to the question, where people do really have conflict. Now, at the same time, a lot of the benefits are huge in the aggregate, but comes with winners and losers, which is traditionally what we do in trade. So how do we compensate the people that might potentially lose from the winners so that the pie is distributed? So the two things are clearly related. So democratic legitimacy, ability to redistribute the benefits, that is really the political challenge. And then, of course, it builds with, it links to the narrative and a lot of the specifics. So this would be, my general comment. But in general, I love the fact of going back and forth. One of my favorite drinks is Caffè Americano in the United States, because it's a Italian interpretation of an American drink that now I can drink in the United States. So I want the back and forth. I would be probably more likely to go back to Italy for a extended period of time if I knew that I could keep back and forth. At some point I had an offer from an Italian university. I said, if I go back, it's irreversible. And I don't want the reversibility. Still, there are people who went back to Italy, economists like Guido Tabellini and Giavazzi, that have built great institutions like Bocconi, building on this back and forth. And so I think there are models, but a lot of this has to be democratically legitimate. And maybe sometime there is to be an understanding that some groups have a legitimate concern about losses, and we shouldn't just despise that, but we should integrate, and so that would be the general comment. But please.
You want to speak to the issue of cities and
I was gonna say something about that. So the cities, that's actually a very big discussion in economics. So we have this whole idea of amenities mattering, and for highly skilled migrants in particular, I think cities are a big amenity. Like people do want to have nice places to live with, like-minded people to talk to, like nice restaurants to eat at, nice, like all these kinds of stuff. And if you don't have that, again, how do you sort of build, I don't know, a Paris out of nothing? It's not. It is a significant detriment for moving into certain areas of a country and certain countries even. And then so there's a lot on the amenities. I don't think we have resolved the issue by any means. The other question was related to the savings coming from the skilled migrants. I completely agree. I think the high skilled migrants are the ultimate free lunch. Like that's what everyone wants, the ultimate free lunch, to sort of take something that somebody else paid for, and then good for us for receiving it.
So there were a few things. I'll try to be short on all. Very, very interesting issue on Saudi Arabia. My comments were more on the skilled migrants and the issue of diversification, and how how integration could bring about more spillovers from the people that are already there to the local economy. But the language issue is really important. So if you have foreigners that come in, they don't speak your language. It has been shown in many studies that this is the first major obstacle to not just integrating, but being productive at all in an economy. And it seems that the United States have been very successful. I don't know whether it's the feature of the language or the availability of teaching. Yeah, I mean, once you learn the language, the social mobility, it increases enormously. And this is something that Europe has been doing wrong with the migration of the 70s and the 80s. And today, for instance, in Germany, it's mandatory for migrants to learn the language for the case they stay in the country. So this is something that that could be arranged, that in free time people learn Arabic, so that if Saudi Arabia needs this mobility upwards, that's made possible. On the issue of whether we should distinguish between migrants and return migrants, not really. I think that a lot of the things that happen, so for instance, what we're seeing in Albania, actually it's happening in the United States. Sari's own research shows that also in the United States, migrants are like twice more likely to start a firm than others are. So a lot of the entrepreneurial patterns we see. But then also, yes, it does matter, and it matters for issue like what we discussed, language, cultural proximity. We have seen a lot of diaspora connections in China, in Taiwan, in India, in Israel, that technology moves. And this goes back to Enrico's research, that technology moves easier along cultural and ethnical lines than between cultures, for reasons that Enrico explained very much. So some of the behavior is it's common to both migrants and return migrants, and then how you integrate and what kind of activities you engage in depends on some cultural issues.
If I could just address two of the questions that have gone sort of unaddressed. One about, and they both have the same nature of what about skills building in the country and what about the long-term solution of education. I want to make the very negative point that Everybody's been trying that for a long time, and I think a lot of reasons are coming up of why that's just not going to work. Because if knowledge is tacit, you really can only transfer it by moving people. And so the idea that, you know, we're going to create, you can create skills training at relatively low levels, but if you don't have somebody in your country who has the skill, you can't bootstrap your way into having the skill, even at the low level. And then second, with agglomeration economies, you can't bootstrap your way into having a lot of people enough that you can do the skill. So low levels of skills, you can talk about skill formation to be masons and skill formation to be plumbers. But you know, if you're going to move into biotech, just the bootstrapping your way into biotech just ain't going to happen. And there's a huge array of industries. The second is the kind of, you look at Colombia, right? I think we haven't been brutally honest enough about the gap in skills. You know, Colombia participates in the PISA exam. The PISA exam, the average OECD country, the student scores 500. And in an OECD country, a student that scored 400 would be borderline placed in remedial instruction. The average score in Colombia is 400, right? And the distribution, the equality in Colombia is actually, it's more equal in its scores, which is terrible. Which means if you took the number of global top 10% Colombians that emerge from the high school system in a given year, you can put them in one room. There just aren't thousands of global top 10% cognitive skill Colombians being produced by the system. So it just, you have to think of ways of complementing that. And then the long run's very long. If you calculate the average pace at which countries are converging in the scores of their children to the OECD, the typical developing country can expect to converge to the average OECD level in about 100 years. So the grandchildren's 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 grandchildren will roughly be at OECD levels of education from which you could think of building the skills base out. So the long run at current paces of progress is very long because, in some sense, countries are very far from producing the raw material out of their education systems that could even become the kind of global high-skill talent. And then, as Sari pointed out, you're losing lots of those. So I do think these aren't, you know, short-run year or two things. These are an integral part of what a long-run strategy has to address, and it has to be addressed, I think, in a way. I think we've been a little namby-pamby about really owning up to just the massive gaps there are in these areas, and that over-optimistic in the extent to which you can bootstrap your way into a whole bunch of tacit skills. So with that, we will conclude our session. Thank you very much to the speakers.